we've talked about clients getting savvier, we've talked about talent being more available than ever, we've talked about the consumer being in more control than ever before. I mean, how do you grow a commercial enterprise in that world? Do you just pack up and go home, or do you change your model, or, what would be your advice to a creative director in an ad agency or an MD of an ad agency? Adam, do you want to have a go? I mean, I know it's a different world to you, but
I think there's an opportunity for agencies to adapt to a new model, which is more of a kind of a fluid distributed model of kind of creation, which is to be the point person for the brand, because the brand will always want a point person or somebody they can hold and give a budget to and pay the money to. But actually, for that creative or that individual to go out and source messages from the web or from popular culture, I think that's the kind of key component. You don't need to have 10 very expensive creatives in a room on a full, on a salary year in, year out. I think you can actually go out there and find ideas and credit them where credit is due rather than steal them. I think that's there's more of a distributed fluid model for agencies, and I think it's going to be interesting to see who is the kind of first person to kind of do that.
But the
goes against what
the point you're making is to source and credit the influences that have inspired you.
Absolutely.
So copying, mashing up, that is part of culture.
Totally.
But ultimately, the agencies should, in your view, take a deeper level of responsibility for sharing the credit. I mean, Si, do you have a view on if somebody in the room bumped into you and said, "I've heard you're unemployed, come and run DDB, VBDO, TBWA, JWT, blah, blah, blah." And you go, "Yeah, I will, but here are my terms and my conditions."
What would my terms be?
Well, you clearly, if you're representing the consumer, what does the consumer want an advertising agency to be? Or do they just not give a shit?
I think, for me, being, especially coming from the digital side, and that's where a lot of the popular culture is at the moment, the fundamental change for designing digital brands these days is about brand behaviour, how a brand behaves, and fundamentally different from what messages we can push out and how big is the spend of to get it in front of them. It's like, if I was going to start one of those agencies, going back to the very simple truth of the brand, to make sure that if the brand that these people are controlling, if it's an FMCG brand, it's a bowl of cornflakes in the morning, their messaging isn't a banquet. It's not bigger than the consumption of their own product. I think advertising has got a glorified, massive ego that they think these messages are going to change it. No, we sell stuff, make better products, make great messaging that is appropriate and truthful, and start acting like a human, because the digital space is lots and lots of humans working and creating their own stuff. Act like them rather than like massive broadcast TV stations, because no one's watching that either.
I mean, Paul, do you have a final point from a client point of view before we open it up to questions? I mean, would you even employ an ad agency, or are you tempted by these gentlemen on the sofas offer?
No, definitely the unemployed one. I think it's a very good question. I mean, if as a client you can take a position of knowing the story you want to tell, and you have the mental, if you have the capability in-house to actually manage that story, I'm not sure you do need the ad agency. I mean, unless part of that story is traditional output. By traditional, I mean the output they're currently creating. I mean, a lot of our clients, like Microsoft and the rest, they've got a lot of capability in-house. So it's a good question.
So, I mean, just to summarise before we throw it open for the audience, I think the interesting things for me is, in this new world, clients are going to take more responsibility in-house for, whether we call it classic planning skills or storytelling skills or in-house design capability. The gap between that client and the talent is probably narrower than it ever has been. In the past, the thought of a client talking to talent was unfathomable. It was almost like two aliens. It wouldn't make sense. Now, if the client upskills and the talent are more amenable, then there's no reason why that dialogue shouldn't happen. And then I think the point that Simon's made very well is that perhaps the world that they're borrowing from, stealing, if we want it to be cunts maybe, but the world that they're taking from is actually now bigger than the commercial communications world that they're in. And that raises big, big challenges, because you used to be able to steal from people on graduate trainee programs, but now the digital world is so big, actually to steal from it is actually vaguely embarrassing. So I I mean, I think that's an interesting context for how we're all going to go about building ideas in the future, and love to open it to the floor if anybody's got any thoughts, questions, or on anything that's been said. Can't see that, gonna have to turn around. What's the best original idea you've seen this year? So, I mean, Si, do you want to start with that? Well, I'm only the compare mate, I told you. Well, I mean,
hot potato. Do you want butter with that one?
it doesn't have to be a commercial idea. What's the best original idea you've seen this year? Is it an iPhone application? Is it like a new service? Is it?
Again, here's a poll. All these reports saying the apps or iPhone apps or any application is going to be bigger than the internet. I read an article. It's like, what do they mean? It's just nuts. Apathy is what I've got. I've got hundreds of apps on my iPhone and I use 3 of them. It's bollocks.
Weather in Amsterdam is useful, I found.
It's wet.
Yeah, it's wet.
And grey.
But have you seen any great, or anybody seen anything that's kind of inspired them in any shape or form?
I mean, the genre of material I think is most inspiring is the stuff we just saw, which is created from the street up, and is almost it's sticking twos up at the establishment. That's where I think there's passion to it.
Yeah.
You know, you can
And authenticity.
You watch that, you just feel the energy of
The
that guy.
interesting thing about Cassette Boy, I think I'm right in saying, hopefully I'm not breaking any confidences, he doesn't want to entertain the commercial world. He's a librarian. He does that sort of stuff for fun.
On his contact
He
list.
sent me an email recently, and I realised that on his contact list I was under pushy agent. So I thought this isn't going to go very far. But that's interesting because it is an authentic voice that doesn't want to, whilst it's manipulating existing content, doesn't want to feel it's being manipulated itself. So,
any more questions? Don't know whether there's any more going to come up on that screen. Again, can't read it. Sorry. Who is the bravest client in terms of giving up control to the public?
I think I've answered that one for me.
Well, you mentioned Burger King. For me, I think some of the work Cadbury's been doing is interesting. Just putting stuff out there, giving people tools to play with.
Well, going back to Burger King, I love what they've been doing. The Whopper sacrifice. Has everyone seen that? That's one of the best ideas I've seen in a long time. Burn your friends on Facebook. Facebook went mental. Didn't last very long. I loved that. The problem I've got is I hate burgers.
Yeah.
I think they're really great, but I would never eat a burger. Do something that, if you make cars, I'll buy a car. But, I think the way that they're behaving is great, but their products still ain't great.
I've got a slightly different take on that question. I mean, there's bravery at the execution level, but then I think there's bravery at the centre, like at the board level. So I'll give you the example of the BBC, which we worked with last 12 months back. The BBC for the last 50 years has been very good at telling its story. It's very one way, and they're some of the best storytellers in the world, the best news reporting, arguably. But they're pretty good. And what they do is they've been telling that story one way, and 12 months ago there was a complete U-turn in the boardroom, which was, our story can no longer be our story. Our story is your story, the audience. And the reason for that, as you all know probably, is that in the UK you're forced to pay a tax so the BBC can exist. It's that level and we know that from research, over 50% of consumers don't want the BBC to be charging them. They'd rather do away with it. So I think it's I think in terms of, the bravest client, I think the bravest clients are right at the CEO level and the board level, and they take a decision that they're going to manage it differently.
I mean, for me, it was kind of Eurostar letting Shane Meadows make a feature film. And as I understand it, he had total creative freedom with it. And I think that's a really interesting and innovative model. And as I kind of also understand, you'd think, having done that, it would be an easy idea to replicate. But actually, the brands are very, very reluctant to let anybody do that and have that control.
Any more for any more? Not sure. Is that still the same one?
Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions from the floor? Anybody want to shout up anything?
Give me a job.
Anybody want to employ Simon?
Not after what you've said.
Yeah.
I didn't mean it, I swear.
It's a guy here with the stripy arms.
Okay. How can you manage a story and at the same time give it away to the audience? I mean, at the beginning, the guy with the glasses on
Paul.
the left.
Oh.
No, on the left. Paul. Sorry. You're talking about you have to really think of your story as your brand.
Yeah.
As if you're a brand, but then you have to give it away. So how do you cope these two things?
Yeah, I'm not pretending it's easy. I mean, what we do with clients is the first step is to decide the story you want to tell, and there's a lot of thinking that needs to go into that in terms of like what genre of story is it, what role are you going to give the various stakeholders, including consumers, and it's really when you get to what we call story mapping. So you know what story you want to tell, but then you kind of look at what the activity is that you've got planned going forward, and what you do is you then invent ways to basically bring in. So if you know that there's artists at street level who are creating material, it's like how do you manage the various stakeholders? And it really is. I mean, the grown-up response to what's happening is to manage a brand as a story, but take 360-degree view of that story and do your damnedest to manage it. But the real trick of it is to acknowledge that you're not in control. You've got to acknowledge as a client. That's what I mean by brave clients. Brave clients, I think, realise they're not in control, but they still tell their story. I don't know if that answers your question fully, but
It's challenging, definitely. Any more questions or observations? Is that somebody scratching their head, or is that a question? That's a head scratch, wasn't it? Sorry. Oh, brilliant. Sorry, head scratch. Sorry, I didn't mean to. We're desperate for questions. If anybody got any nervous twitches, keep your hands down now. Yeah.
You put me in a really awkward position
Sorry.
right now.
Well, we'll all scratch our heads, something.
Could you say the function of an ad agency is going to change over the future?
Hell yes.
Yeah.
How do you think it will change? What will our function be for the client?
better question.
It has to fundamentally change. Just when John was introducing me earlier, the dot-com boom and bust. I've been in companies that, very, very quickly over 11 years became the wrong shape and became a dinosaur. And the market was not a negative market, but a vindictive market, and it stripped all of us out, killed all of us. Advertising's long held a very safe seat with a big purse next to the client's ear going, these are the messages you want to give. And now those people are listening to the consumer, they're out there more, they're doing this 360. And I think advertising has to now play fair and play with more people. When we talk about the same case studies like Apple and Google and all these other things, do they do good advertising? Yes, but they do good product, they do good ambassadorship, they do, it's all joined up. The same brief that somebody designed the iPhone for is the same brief that they give the advertising agency. It's the same one. Don't do more research and be off-piece. Keep to the same story, keep the same insight. So,
I've got a thought on that as well.
Go on.
Finished.
No, I never finished.
I
never finished. I'll be here
straight across you.
I'll be here all week.
I think that relates to the previous question. Because I think the winners in Adland, I think the agencies that will thrive will be the ones that help manage the clients through this process. I think the agencies have to stand up and take responsibility for not just accepting the new world order, but helping educate the clients and take them with them as a. And I'm not talking about agencies coming up with product ideas, and we've all done that. But it's more of a philosophical change. And if I was to jump out 5 years into the future, I would guess an agency would be more like the storytelling units that I associate with Pixar, which take responsibility not just for the story they're telling, but for every aspect of it. In terms of the reaction to it, the manifestation of it in terms of physical product and services, and then map that out over the next 3 years and really be the partner to the client in that journey.
I think one final point from me on that, it would be, I think to make it all happen, ad agencies need to work more open source. They need to have collaboration in their DNA. Collaboration is a very, very easy word to say and a very, very hard thing to do. And my experience working with ad agencies is they're probably some of the least collaborative people in terms of actually being able to pull on stimulus and credit. For me, it's as much about a mental shift, really. It's just like, you can't do everything, guys. So become the client's trusted ally, you know, take on board more responsibility, but recognize that you need to work with a host of other talent to make your ideas come to life. And if you're going to steal it, credit it. But anyway, I think...
I'm just going to say one final thing.
Yeah.
You know, the thing about this is it sounds a bit negative and scary.
Yeah, it's great.
But I think this is the most exciting thing that's happened to brands in 2 decades, I would imagine. Because basically, the gloves are off. You know, basically, this is true creating a mutual creation. That's the most exciting thing.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I hope you found our improvised panel interesting, and we'll be around later if you've got any questions. Thank you. Thank you very much.